Hi and hello watch fans, and welcome back to the Real Time Show with me, your friendly neighbourhood watchmaker, Rob Nuds. Today we are recording on behalf of London Watch Week, organised in part by our good friend Lucy Cheesewright. And she's brought along two wonderful guests to talk about the importance of pre-owned and authenticity in the industry. We have Daniel Somlo, Somlo Antiques, and we have Nick Bennet of Watch Collecting. Welcome to the studio, both of you. It's a pleasure to talk about this very interesting and current topic. You are both experts. You have lots of stories from behind the scenes, I'm sure. We're going to start with Daniel, an old schoolmate of mine from the British School of Watchmaking. So welcome to the airwaves, Daniel. It's good to have you on the Real Time Show.
Really good to be here. Thank you for having me.
So why don't you describe to our listeners who can't see you as I can where exactly you are and what you're going to be doing today?
So I'm upstairs in our shop, just off Bond Street in Burlington Arcade, and sort of hiding out. So you may hear a buzzer every now and then with the normal hustle and bustle of crowds of people descending on us, which would be nice. Or it might be completely quiet, which is a sad sort of state of affairs of the industry. Yeah, I mean, in our industry, obviously, pre-owned is essentially what I do, and the topic of authenticity is a ever-present and sort of constant debate and struggle that we have to kind of deal with day to day. It's something that's at the forefront of a lot of collectors' minds, especially when a lot of the things that we're dealing with do factually cost a lot of money, and people don't really want to be throwing away a bunch of their money on something that may not be completely genuine. And it's about how do you ascertain as to whether it is, whether the brand supports it, or whether it's something that you just kind of have to put your trust in to somebody.
You alluded to a slowness in the industry there, which is obviously something we'd like to talk about. Have you noticed a significant downturn in business over the last 12, 18 months?
I mean, I suppose I was joking a little bit, but it's been peaks and troughs, I think. Obviously with the state of the world, a lot of people are a bit hesitant to part with money, and understandably. When you get sort of periods of economic instability, people tend to rather keep hold of their assets and keep hold of things. So you actually find that sometimes less decent watches make it onto the market when things are like that. So you'd think people would be sort of panicking and trying to sell everything off, but actually when they're uncertain, they kind of want to keep hold of everything and maintain status quo. So there have been periods where it's been difficult to buy and periods where it's been difficult to sell. But I'd say at the moment, it's been all right. We can't really complain too much. We've been doing okay and managing our way through, and where some things sort of tail off, other things start to come up again. So it's just about managing it.
It's very interesting. When it's a period of economic instability, as you rightly referenced, we're experiencing right now, it becomes more of a buyer's market, I would say, because the people that do want to offload their assets often do so in a slightly more desperate manner than when times are good, and so a good price can be had. And post-COVID, we've seen, I would say, a slight restabilization in the pre-owned market in terms of prices being asked for pieces. It went insane throughout that COVID period, which I'm sure brought its own challenges for you as well in terms of volume. But right now, what are you seeing? Do you have any insight in the behavior of consumers? Are they more likely to buy vintage in economic unstable times, or are they more likely to buy new, or is it simply even across the board that they're holding on to their assets in cash, as you mentioned?
I'd say it's fairly even in some ways. I think the way that people have been buying has changed since the COVID craziness. People have started really, especially in this, as you said, this period of kind of correction after the instability. People who were, focusing on the big Patek and Rolex sort of markets. Have got sort of fed up of it or burned by it through, the stumbling of a lot of the prices on the secondary market, and they've been looking to kind of diversify a little bit. So we've definitely seen an uptick in people interested in vintage. But I'd say the difficulty lies in managing expectations for that, because people got so used to buying all of these things, and all of a sudden, the second you walk out the shop, it's worth 3x what you paid for it, and now it's not. And they think, oh well, what vintage stuff can I buy that will do that? And well, it's really not that simple. Otherwise, I'd not be talking to you from the office above my shop. I'd be speaking to you from my lovely private island, from an early retirement, I think.
Well, of course, we all wish that for you. And before we move over to Nick to
Thank
bring him
you.
into the conversation, I would like you to give our audience a little bit of background on you and how you got into this industry, and whether or not when you started work in the trade, you envisaged owning your own island one day, or whether that's just something that's just popped into your head recently.
Well, I suppose my journey started around 19 years old. I initially studied architecture at university, and but this was the troubling times of 2008, where it wasn't the best time to do a lot of things, including architecture. So I ended up spending a summer working at the shop, and absolutely fell head over heels in love with watches from then on, and thought to myself, well, I need to try and bring something a bit different to the business. So studied watchmaking, where I met yourself, and yeah, which was really helpful. Then I was contracted to Swatch Group and working on Omegas for a couple of years in Southampton, before coming back here and kind of starting the process of taking over and managing the shop day to day, working with my parents, and working towards the island dream.
The island dream, yeah, we all have that. I have it even more intensely now I've heard you aspire to it as well. So this is a family business that you joined. So you've been in and around watches and antique watches for many, many years, since you were a child, I guess, or did your parents start the business while you were alive?
No, so my parents have been, I'm sort of the arguably third generation to kind of go into it. My grandfather started doing it when he came over from Hungary, and doing Portobello Road, selling odds and ends, pocket watches and things like that, which was very much more the direction of watch collecting at that time. Um, and my dad sort of built it up into a brick and mortar shop and established the business. So it's my job not to mess it up now.
No pressure. So, Nick, what's your background like? Is your story similar to Daniel's? Is it something that you've been into for a long time, or been around for a long time, or did you come to it later on in life?
Well, unfortunately for me, I don't have the lineage and heritage of Daniel's history in watches. I've been a certified watch geek for a very long time, but I haven't worked in the industry for quite the same amount of time. So I was working in a completely different industry when the pandemic started, and then watch collecting started up. It's actually the sister platform of collecting cars, which you mentioned at the top of the show, which was already in existence. And the owner of collecting cars decided, hey, we could apply this same logic to watches and start a watch platform. So I was already following collecting cars at the time because I was also a car nerd. I saw an advertisement for a job and I thought, you know what, I'm going to give this a shot. Anyway, they asked me to write about a 5513 Submariner. And I was the only person who picked up that it was a service dial. So they kind of figured, okay, maybe this person doesn't, maybe not know a lot, but is at least interested and knows enough to be able to identify certain things. So they said, yep, you've got a job. And I started here initially writing descriptions of watches for listings, and then moved on to consigning and now working in marketing and content. So I had a bit of a journey through the business since it started in 2021. But, going back to what you were saying about the state of the industry at the moment, for me, we've seen a really interesting journey in the watch world because we started in April 2021, right as this COVID pandemonium was kicking off. So we were right in the thick of it. And funnily enough, we almost got used to it being like that. And it wasn't until, say, 2022, 2023, things started to fall off a little bit that we noticed, hey, this is not normal. That was a unprecedented set of global events which impacted on the watch world. But what I do find interesting is that since then, yes, a lot of the flippers in the market, for example, have left. They've moved on to something else to try and make a quick buck. But now we're seeing so many people contacting us who are genuine watch lovers who have actually gotten into the hobby through this COVID pandemonium where people were always talking about watches as investments. But off the back of that, people have started to realize that watches are actually an amazing thing to collect. And there's a really strong community around that. And we're actually seeing the pre-owned market within our business remain quite strong. And the interesting conversation we're having in the office at the moment is around cars versus watches and the pre-owned market between the two. Because the pre-owned car market it's a lot older in terms of it being a mainstream thing. Whereas I think watches, it's relatively new. And for me, I see it right now as quite a healthy industry. And I think that's really evidenced by like Rolex certified pre-owned program, like even the big manufacturers now are waking up and thinking, you know what, like people really care about pre-owned and they're looking to buy pre-owned watches. So for me, I feel quite excited about the pre-owned watch space right now. And I think there's a lot of upside. Obviously, people have concerns like authentication, which we'll get into, but overall, I see it as a positive.
I'm interested in your audience because you already had an established platform of which watch collecting is an offshoot. You already had an established target audience who one would assume being car collectors are also quite high net worth individuals, which are quite likely to find themselves falling down the watch rabbit hole as soon as they realize it exists. Do you have a lot of crossover from your previous clients to clients now that trust you because of the service you provided previously?
Yeah, we have a lot of crossover. I think there's so many synergies between cars and watches. And speaking personally, I love both. And I think there's a real synergy between design and mechanics where they come together. And there's very few people that we speak to, either on the car platform or the watch platform, aren't into the other hobby or haven't heard of the other platform. So yeah, we have a lot of business moving between the platforms. And I think the fact that collecting cars started in 2019 and had a 2-year run up to watch collecting commencing really helped us as a business.
I mean, it sounds to me like watch collecting was started, I wouldn't say purely opportunistically, but you're the founder saw an opening in the market and thought, okay, you know what, we have an established way of working which can port quite comfortably, quite naturally over to this other collecting niche. That to me is almost accidentally genius that you established a platform in a tangential industry that has a lot of shared values and people that like cars tend to like them for the same reasons as people like watches. It's design, it's mechanics, it's art and science coming together. It's these things which were once necessary tools and not really collectible but necessary. Now they are quite unnecessary in many ways. Cars less so than watches, of course, but certainly old cars, combustion engines, like classic designs. People nowadays maybe wouldn't say, okay, that's going to be my daily run around. I'm not going to drive to work or into the centre of London in a 1950s T-Bird, but, I would like to have one for the weekend to go out and enjoy, the beauty of automotive engineering. You can't fake that kind of moment. It can't really be as contrived as it can be fortuitous when it falls into the right hands, and it seems to have fallen into the right hands with you and your team. How many people do you have working across both platforms now for the company?
In total, we have, I believe, there's 80 people in the company, roundabouts.
80?
Yeah, there's a lot of people, and we are the HQ is in London, but we also have offices in Paris, in Hong Kong, and Sydney as well. The aim is really to create a global platform for collectors of cars and watches. And one of the most interesting things to me about having a global presence is seeing what watches and cars are popular in what regions, and also what people are buying across borders as well. So to me, that's a really curious part of having different locations in different places around the world.
So do you find that there are consistencies in the style of watches and cars that are bought in different regions? I don't think I've ever tried to do that before. I ever tried to say, okay, if you like coupes, then you're going to like chronographs, or if you like monster trucks, then you're going to like tool watches. But do you find that that's a thing?
That's a really good question. I don't think there's necessarily any really strong patterns that we're seeing between certain car buyers and, say, for example, the watches that they like. I do think there is some connection between, for example, someone who purchases, say, an old 911 may be partial to, say, a vintage sports watch, maybe like a vintage Saab or GMT or Explorer 2. I think there's some overlap there, but for me, curiously, I haven't seen any really strong patterns between the two. Perhaps someone who is buying a Lamborghini Aventador might be partial to a Richard Mille. I guess if we're talking about overlaps between a certain aesthetic, then maybe. But I think generally there doesn't seem to be any strong connection.
What kind of age range are we talking in terms of the watches that you most often trade? Are we talking kind of very modern vintage? Are we talking extremely modern, like in the last 5-10 years, like basically bought off the shelf, kept with box papers, stickers, and then sold later on for a profit? What's the kind of dynamic there?
I would say most of the watches we sell are pieces that are 10 years old or younger, but we also do sell a lot of stuff in the neo-vintage area. I mean, I don't, the whole term neo-vintage, I don't really know exactly what people think that where that starts, but I would say probably from the 80s up and through to 2000. We also sell a lot of Rolex sports watches in that era too.
This is something, Dan, you might be able to provide some help for us with when it comes to terminology, because I've always thought vintage is maybe anything from like anything that's 30 years old but younger than an antique, which by definition I would always think is 100 years old. And so neo vintage for me would be anything that's not new but within a 30-year time frame. How does that match up with how you use the terms in Somlo?
I mean, I think it's a bit of a moving target because, like you said, for antiques, there's a definition. It's 100 years or older. But for terms like vintage, where there isn't really a particular time scale that it's kind of associated. I mean, when I was first started in the industry, vintage was, like you said, 30, 35 years or older, which was a nice sort of match up to the sort of 70s, which is, 70s and earlier, which you kind of associate vintage watches of 70s and earlier. Today, 20 odd years later, are you really going to say that something from the 1990s is vintage? I don't know that I necessarily would, but then maybe that's how I've grown up with it. So I think it kind of then comes down to style rather than necessarily pure age. So I would say neo vintage, like you said, is kind of 80s, 90s, whereas vintage is 70s and older.
Interesting. Well, that is an interesting point, actually, because you say it's a moving target, but I suppose the range moves constantly with antiques. Of course, it moves every day, like every second it moves towards that 100-year threshold where something officially becomes an antique. I did just Google what the general consensus for vintage is, and apparently Google reckons it's anything over 20 years old. So between 20 and 99 years is vintage, and younger than that, I guess the term neo-vintage would apply in Google's mind. I mean, we don't have to listen to Google because we're actually in the industry and Google isn't. It just thinks it is. So that's strange, because you're right, of course, when we started out in watchmaking, vintage was quite comfortably what we now see as a style of vintage watch. The problem we have when it comes to things like the 80s and the 90s, which by Google's definition would quite clearly be vintage now, is that they're very modern products. And so they don't have that same flavor, they don't have that same style. So I do see what you're saying, but of course there will come a point in around 45 years' time where something from 1970 is an antique and therefore no longer vintage. And so everything else maybe is slightly more homogenized because watchmaking got to that point stylistically and technically where they'd kind of figured it out, as it were. And we have to readjust and make up new terms to define these brackets more cleanly and more relevantly to the buying public and for our own sakes further down the line. But it's an interesting conversation and very interesting to hear how those terms are being used in practice on the shop floor. So let's talk about the authenticity side of things now and how you actually go about authenticating something. As Nick mentioned, he caught the attention of his current employer by being able to tell that a particular Rolex had a service style. Now, even I, as a watchmaker who hasn't worked extensively on Rolex, wouldn't really be able to tell that. Dan, what are the processes you go through when you are presented with a watch and you have to authenticate it before you decide whether you want to buy it in? And then how do you communicate that to your would-be customers?
I suppose it's a very good question. It's definitely brand specific. Obviously, doing what we do, we tend to specialize in sort of a few brands rather than like a more sort of large few, which does make it easier to kind of tailor the buying process to each sort of thing. Initially, I mean, and most importantly, it comes down to experience. We have one junior person in the shop who's been here for 2.5 years, but other than that, I'm the next most junior person here, and I've been in the watch industry for 17 years now. And yeah, so it's literally just having looked at loads and loads and loads of pieces, picking up every bit scrap of information that you can, using the resources that are available to you, and when the brands support it, being able to check in with them. We're very fortunate with our partnership with Omega as their sort of official vintage partner, that we, despite the fact that they no longer offer an extract service, which is something that I'll come on to in a second, but aside from the fact that they don't offer that, we are uniquely able to actually contact the heritage department directly and have things checked out with the consent of whoever's selling it prior to buying anything, because we don't want to be in a position where we bought something and found out after we bought it that the movement's been swapped, which is another common theme of the 70s and 80s. But yeah, it's only been in the last sort of 15 years really where people have been that concerned over originality and authenticity, and have wanted everything to be absolutely spot on inside the watch as much as it can be, as well as outside of it. So we're very lucky that we still have this great relationship with Omega, that we can check on things and make sure that they're right before buying them. So every Omega that we have, we know to the day when it was made, where it was sent to. But other brands, I mean, Patek, you can order an extract, but then you are really kind of hoping that it's correct when you buy it, because that takes weeks in order to get. And there are very, very few places that are willing to hang about for however many weeks to find out that the watch is not actually going to be for you because it's got a replaced movement, or parts have been changed, or the dial's been changed. So an awful lot of it comes down to just knowing what a service dial looks like, as Nick said, being able to identify replaced parts and what could be original, what could not be original. And sometimes you do kind of feel a little bit like Dr. House, analyzing the watch and saying like, well, that does look period correct, but is the aging in keeping with the rest of the watch? Has that been put together like a Franken watch? And that's just through seeing so many of them. Cartier is a really interesting one to kind of look at, because obviously Cartier has become very popular in the last few years, which I think is probably a bit of a result of people getting a bit fed up of the Patek and Rolex secondary market and looking to see what else is out there. And Cartier, vintage Cartier especially, is such an undervalued thing for such a long time. Not so much anymore. But yeah, when, Cartier was a very kind of bespoke orientated company, and they were a jeweler rather than a watchmaker. They didn't actually make that many watches until the 70s. And there was so much bespoke work and sort of client directed work that went on, and a lot of stuff was very discreet, not really documented. So you do kind of come down to what do you think was done? What was done by customer request? What was part of the kind of procedure? London Cartier, for example, when you only get like a handful of watches made compared to the Paris Maison, a lot of the stuff, I mean, there was maybe like a handful of watches made, and they were all made here, and nobody jotted down how they made them or what they made them with. And Cartier were very good at keeping their clients sort of hush hush and not telling anyone. That was part of their trademark, and that's kind of a bit of a problem for us these days. But you do the best you can, and go to people that you trust to know what they're talking about.
Okay, you've given me a segue into 3 questions, so bear with me. We don't have to go into huge amounts of detail with each of these answers, but I'd like to knock them off because they're relevant points, I think. Firstly, why did Omega stop doing the extract service?
I think it was after sort of Speedmaster Gate, the big sort of Phillips sale. I think they did a big revamp of how they want to do the authentication. We are still hopeful that they will bring it back at some point, but I think trying to get it done in such a way that you're preventing counterfeit extracts being made, which apparently was something also that was happening. And you're dealing with a company which is produced watches on a scale that's much, much larger than a lot of the other watch houses. You know, Patek have very, very good records. Omegas do have very good records for most things, but there was also apparently a fire and a flood periodically in the 60s, which ruined a lot of things. A lot of the movements were sourced from companies like Lemania and finished at Omega rather than being produced by them themselves. So I mean, I don't envy the heritage department's job trying to make head or tail of the loss of it. So that's why it's currently not functioning, but I am hopeful that they will get it back. So I think it's a really good way of engaging with the collectors community, having that sort of company backed authentication of how the watch started life, put it that way.
Next question. Did you ever watch Only Fools and Horses?
Yes.
Do you remember the famous scene where Trigger tells his friends that he's had the same broom for 20 years and it's only had 17 new heads and 14 new handles? Because this always comes to mind. This always comes to mind for me when I think about watches, right? So I was recently talking to Fred Savage, who has started a company called Timepiece Grading Specialists in the US, in Ohio. This episode will come out in a couple of weeks. It's very interesting because he talks in depth about how they've defined a grading service. So each watch gets a score, and it will get scores across multiple categories, and then it will be compiled into a final score as to its final grade, similar to how you would grade a diamond, you know? So nothing they've ever seen has got a 10, which is basically like gem perfect rating, because even a brand new watch, you know, it might have been somewhat mishandled, or the minute it has its stickers taken off, loses something about its perfection. How do you look at a watch that, say, for example, has been serviced multiple times since its release with all genuine parts? Maybe it's been refinished, maybe it's not. That's a different kettle of fish, of course. But it has nothing non-authentic within it, but it has not got the original parts. How do you communicate this trigger broom philosophy to the customer? And do you have a grading service to reflect that, like how original something is versus how authentic it is?
I mean, that's the key, isn't it? The difference between those two things, original and authentic. I mean, you can have a completely authentic watch, which isn't remotely original. It has all factory OEM parts, what you want to call them, but those parts have been upgraded over the years and aren't necessarily the same. I mean, it is. I mean, it's just a subjective thing as well. People have different preferences. Some people really don't care when some parts have been changed. Me personally, you know, you take a Speedmaster or something, and if it's been used at all in its life, it's probably going to have worn parts on the inside, which are going to have been changed because otherwise it wouldn't work. And therein the problem with watches versus jewelry. It has to work for better or worse. And so, yeah, I mean, me personally, I'm not really that fussed if it's got replaced wheels and things on the inside because they're working parts that get wear. Externally, though, like I said it before, it's only been in recent sort of history that collecting has been very focused on originality rather than necessarily authenticity. And so you think, especially a watch like a Speedmaster, which, you know, is a tool watch at its core, and the early ones especially were generally bought by people who wanted to use them for their function. They were battered around, you know, they were owned by pilots and by, you know, people in the military, and they were saw some things and did some things which may add to the story of the watch, but dinged bezels, broken glass, smashed hands, and then it went back to factory and they just replaced it with the current version of that part, which was updated. As far as the company was concerned, they were doing you a favor, giving you the latest version of it. But now you've got a watch which is a complete hodgepodge amalgamation of the years of different parts and things that have been put onto it. And case in point, I had a lovely gentleman who had his very, very, very early Speedmaster, which was his grandfather's. And we're talking about the 1958 Speedmaster, so the year after it was introduced. And this watch had been back to Omega many times, and it had a new dial, it had a new set of hands, it had a new bezel, it had a new, I think the only real original part was basically the case band. And I mean, in a sense, the watch is barely the watch anymore. And as far as they were concerned, they were just kind of maintaining it and keeping it working and up to date because it was bought to be used. But then the watch is worth nothing today on the secondary market, near enough, or it's worth some parts.
Oh, it's a perfect example. That's Trigger's Brewing right there. It's there's a direct lineage to the original piece, and everything within it is authentic, but it's no longer that original piece. Very interesting discussion. I don't know if you remember this. There was an incident. It would have been around 2012, 2013. So it was either the year after you graduated from the British School of Watchmaking or the year before. Down in Southampton, we had a big staff meeting in the workshop, and Susie, our technical manager at the time, Susie Kloss, was asking us this question, our opinion on it, whether or not we should mandatorily upgrade the escapements in 2500 A's and B's to 2500C. And I remember being very vocally against it. Certainly not without asking the customer, because I was like, we can't just take a watch that is now it's obsolete, but it has provenance and it has value to a collector. Because you don't see many A's and B's of the old 2500 escapement on the market, because most of them were taken out and replaced with C's or maybe even D's, but normally C's. And I remember that being not a light bulb moment for her, but something that she really took on board and said, okay, well, yeah, we have to ask people because this is an important thing. Have you ever encountered a similar situation from other brands where there's been a tangible upgrade? Like recently, a couple of years ago, I bought a Glacétur Original chronograph, and it was in a series of 100 pieces, limited edition. And halfway through the sale of this limited edition, they changed the they changed the hairspring from Nivrox to silicon. They didn't communicate it. So half, or not even half, about 24, 25 of these pieces just randomly have a different hairspring. Mine was one of the last ones in the run. In fact, I think the last one, so it had all of the new upgraded parts. But amazingly, it's not even consistent with the first 60, 70, 80 pieces of the same limited edition. Have you ever seen that yourself in another brand or another caliber?
Loads, actually. Yeah, I'd say that's a very common thing. Every major brand is probably guilty of it to some point, and some brands have responded quite well. I think Omega, for example, did quite well as brands go, and are now a lot more conservative with what they will do and what they'll communicate to the customer before doing it. But then other brands, Rolex, for example, will do what they want, basically, because you're so lucky to be dealing with them. And Patek find a decent ground, I think, in the middle.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear, at least from Patek's perspective. But given the fact that, Nick, you work very much, mostly, we would say, with what we're now defining loosely between the three of us as neo-vintage, how does that affect your customers' perspective of authenticity or genuineness or even transparency on a brand's part when it comes to communicating upgrades that don't make it out into the mainstream?
I don't think we've had a lot of customer feedback specifically talking about changes in movements and how that impacts their desire to want to own a particular model. One example I thought of as you guys were chatting was the Explorer 2. Someone was contacting us the other day, specifically looking for an Explorer 2 with a 3186 movement, because they switched from 3185 to 3186 in the last few years of production. And I think Rolex is a great example of this, where they make small changes to their watches it could be aesthetic or it could be part of the movement. And then people find out about it and they start chasing certain examples for particular reasons. Now, from a functionality standpoint, I don't think anyone is going to notice the difference between a 3185 and a 3186 movement on a day-to-day basis, but it's just the fact that it was a small production run of a different movement. People want to own it. And, I actually love the fact that people get so nerdy about this stuff, because I know the 3185 movement, when you try and adjust the local hour hand, you get a tiny little wobble in the 24-hour hand as you adjust it, which doesn't exist on the 3186. And those kind of details, I think, make watch collecting such a cool and interesting and super nerdy hobby.
I absolutely love the nuances of which you're aware when it comes to these movements. It's incredible for me to listen to, because I would never have known that at all. Now I can, next time I have one of those watches in my hands and we were looking for the wobble or the lack thereof. I mean, I'm susceptible to it as well, because I guess my dream Rolex would be a 1985 birth year Explorer 2 with a Panna dial, the white paint that they used for a couple of years before they realized that under UV exposure it went off to a kind of cream color. And, I'm always searching for a perfect example of that flaw that ended up being beautiful.
Yeah, not to jump on the sort of slightly salesy chat, but we do have a 16550 Panadol on the site right now. And the reason I wanted to mention it was because it's a one-owner example, and it was owned by someone from the military. And they took that watch over multiple deployments until they finally took it in for service a few years back. And the watchmaker said, "Great that you're using that for everyday purposes in the military, but just to let you know that this is a seriously collectible watch." And since then, he never wore it, and now has decided to sell it. But definitely worth checking that watch out.
Oh, I 100% will check it out, and I will not be happy about the fact that I might have to part with a lot of cash for it. I'm not going to check it until after the show, because I don't want to faint when I see the projected value of it. But it's a wonderful thing. It's great that the watchmaker let him know that he was in possession of something that was extremely collectible. It's also a bit sad that watch had lived such an incredible life, and now it's a safe queen until it finds its new wrist. But I guess that's the way of things. There are many watches, especially from that era, which, to be honest, may never really have a corollary in the future, because people were buying watches as tools and wearing them as tools, and loads of the old subs are the same, right? They're very beaten up. You find good examples. It's quite rare, because nobody bought those watches then thinking, oh, in 30 years' time, I'm going to sell this for £70,000 or whatever. They thought, okay, this is a watch. Yeah, what the hell? It's a nice watch, but they didn't baby them. They didn't look after them. That's, of course, some of the appeal to us as collectors. But for me, as someone that likes things to be as box fresh as possible, it's a bit of a shame that there are very rarely examples of them in that condition. But Nick, talk to us about your authentication process. What do you do when you encounter a watch for the first time? Do you do everything in-house, or do you send some stuff to external parties to authenticate it for you?
We don't have a certified watchmaker in-house, so we use an external service to help us authenticate certain watches. I would say we have a lot of people in the business who, like me, are super nerdy about watches, and we scrutinize photo sets extremely closely. For example, we recently had someone who submitted a GMT Master 2 to us recently, which was of questionable origin. We looked at the photos, worked out that the hand stack was the wrong way around on the GMT Master 2. Little things like that we noticed, right? The hour hand should be on the bottom, followed by the GMT hand, minute hand, second hand. And they were swapped on this particular watch. So we immediately identified it. So it's little things like that we scrutinize very closely. But, to be completely transparent, we don't have a certified watchmaker on site. But anything that we feel is dubious, we employ the services of an external watchmaker to review the watch and check it carefully. But we also are in a unique situation that, well, it's not unique. We're in a situation where we have watches that are in our safe, in our possession as part of our managed service. But we also sell watches as a mediary between a seller and a buyer. So that poses more challenges for us, because we don't have an opportunity to see the watch in our hands in the office, or have the opportunity to send that to a watchmaker. And so we offer a buyer's protection program where we stand by our assessment of the watch. We're confident that it's authentic. but we also give the buyer an opportunity to check that watch themselves to make sure that they're happy with it, and we cover that with buyer's protection. But I think on top of that, we're also not naive, and we also don't want to kind of rest on our laurels. So we're in the process now of making our authenticity program more robust in a similar way that other platforms do, where even if two people are buying and selling externally but using our platform, we still want to be able to offer the option for a buyer to have that watch authenticated if they want to.
I'm intrigued by this misordered or disordered hand stack. How on earth is that possible? Because surely the hand tube on the GMT hand and the hour hand would prevent that from being plausible.
Swap movement.
So even bigger problem then. There you go. So that's good spot, by the way. I mean, incredible catch, but very unusual. Never really heard that before. That's scary. You ever seen anything like that, Daniel?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, you
talking
get
about this,
them.
this is interesting. So my best friend is well, actually, he was my best friend, but now I've got him into watches. I think he's souring on me a little bit because he has far less disposable income. His first major watch purchase was an Omega Speedmaster Mark 40, which he bought from me before he began a round the world trip on his motorbike. Seeing the difference in that watch's lume from when it set off to now, having been exposed to, I don't know what kind of UV damage, but a lot, like, it was incredible. The hands were perfect. They were green lume, lovely, gorgeous, looked like they'd just never seen the light of day. Now they're completely black. He doesn't mind. He thinks it's perfect. Like, it has this, like, story to it now, which is great. But prior to buying this watch, he had a nice little collection of old Soviet watches, and particularly Raketa. And we were looking at one of his 24-hour movement 24-hour dial Raketers the other day, and he said, is it real? He said he couldn't really find any examples that matched it exactly. So I popped off the back and had a look at the movement number, and I was like, well, yeah, I said, this is the right movement, and everything about this watch seems to be Raketa, but it's been like assembled with a non-standard handset, and the dial is authentic but wouldn't normally match that case design, for example. Everything was real, but it was a complete hodgepodge. However, the assumption that we came away with was it was likely built by Raketa out of bits that they had lying around, because I said, look, at the time, nobody really cared. Like, it was a watch, it was a product, it was a tool. It wasn't something that people were keeping track of from a reference perspective. And this feeds into maybe more your experience, Dan, with like the very historical stuff. When there isn't information available, when there is literally no documentation of a watch, you can assess the components and say, yeah, these look to be genuine parts of this maker, but they've just been put together in a way that has either very few or no visible examples. Where do we stand on that in terms of, well, it's original, we assume, it's authentic, we assume, but it isn't part of a story or a researchable context? What do you do with something like that?
I think you've hit the nail on the head a little bit in that. Something that really bugs me in the industry with a lot of experts is that they categorically think that they can put into like a table or a system exactly what a watch should have, shouldn't have. This reference should have this set of hands and this and when you go more neo vintage or more modern, then yes, I think that's definitely a case for it. But people like that, a lot of the time, forget that you go back 60 years or more. People they used what they had available. They weren't going to chuck away a batch of hands because they were the older reference. They just stick them on the latest things. Otherwise, it would be a waste of hands. I mean, Rolex were very known for doing stuff like this with the sports watches. You know, you'll get one where you'll get a sub or something which has a slightly later bracelet on it, and it wasn't just because they had the bracelet changed, although that is a possibility. It could also just have been, well, we didn't sell all the other ones, and this one was lying around when the new batch of bracelets came in, so we just stuck it on that. And it's a difficult grey area because it could also be something more nefarious, but completely saying like, no, that's impossible, I find is a very naive and narrow-minded kind of way to look at things. And there are definitely sort of experts who preach that everything must be how they say it must be, but a long time ago, people really weren't that bothered, and it wasn't seen as this sort of special, categorized and laid out method of putting things on. So that's where the expertise comes in, and you have to look at whether things look like they belong together or not. And you know, like your friend's watch, whether the rest of the watch looked like it had been on the around the world trip on a motorbike. I'm sure it probably did. Had a few sort of scratches and bits of wear on it, and everything's going to kind of look homogenous. Whereas you see an old 60-year-old tool watch, and the bezel looks like it was made yesterday, but the rest of the watch looks like it's seen a few things. You should ask questions and maybe doubt the provenance a little bit.
I've got a completely theoretical question for you, Nick, and I'm just piecing together. This is a complete composite of several stories and examples I've heard in the past, and we're going to use an example that totally doesn't exist, so we're not being too controversial here, because Rolex very seldom would make a numbered series of watches. They don't really do the whole like limited run of 100 pieces. But let's say, theoretically, there was a Rolex Oyster Perpetual limited to 100 pieces. And a watchmaker in charge of assembling these pieces did so thoroughly and responsibly, and every so often had to pull apart from the production line because it failed QC. Rolex has very high QC standards. And eventually this Rolex watchmaker builds up a kit in his drawer because he doesn't want to throw away components because he's not a wasteful human. And he has enough pieces to assemble an entire Rolex watch that would theoretically be completely legitimate in terms of manufacturing provenance and even assembled within house with the right tools to the right standards, but all the components failed QC, so they couldn't go into like regular production. And he builds this watch using all Rolex components with his Rolex expertise, but it hasn't got a serial number on the back of it. Is that a Rolex or is it not a Rolex?
I love this question, and I love this question. I love the fact that you use Rolex as an example, because I think it's the one brand where that watch would somehow be worth like $1 million. Like right. as in with Rolex, if there's anything about it that's quirky or wrong, somehow it's more valuable. Like I think a while ago, someone was selling an Air King. It was the latest generation. No, sorry, not the latest generation. The one from 2016. I think it's reference 116900, where they put the applied Explorer style 3, 6, and 9 on there. And you were saying Rolex has a very high QC, which they definitely do, but someone had actually put the 9 o'clock marker on the 3 o'clock position, because the shape of the 3, 6, and 9 is so similar. There's only tiny gaps, right? So it's easier to miss. But the person who owns that watch is now asking, say, like $5,000 over what another Air King would be worth, because it's a rare Rolex era dial. It's like Rolex can do no wrong. It's like whatever mistakes they made, now it becomes more collectible. So to come back to your question, I think ironically for a Rolex that was built, it would suddenly become a super rare one of one, no serial number Rolex to come out of the factory. It's that kind of scenario with Rolex. But I think if we look at other brands more broadly, to me that is I would not classify that as a production watch if a watchmaker happened to have all the parts and put something together without a serial number. For me, the serial number is such an important component of a watch being legitimate.
That is a brilliant answer. Thank you for answering it so honestly and candidly, because people sometimes want to dodge those philosophical or theoretical questions, at least. And I think it paints a really interesting picture between the very stark difference between the two areas of the business in which you're both operating, despite the fact that you're both working with pre-owned and you're both working with authenticity and doing your very best to present the truth to your clientele. Because Nick, you are talking very much about like the modern concept of watch collecting, whereas Daniel, you're talking much more about the realities of the history of watchmaking and its slightly murky past by our own when viewed through our own modern lens, but in reality just what happened because it wasn't the same industry. And that's the beauty of the story, the evolution of the craft and how things have been sanitized, sometimes to a less characterful degree, I think. But there's things to enjoy from all eras, and I'm very glad that you're both involved in the fields that you are, and you're making sure that people can enjoy the hobby and make sure that they're spending their money on things that they can trust and believe in and enjoy for many years to come. So we're going to wrap up the show there. I think that was an information and opinion-rich episode, which I hope our listeners enjoy. And anyone visiting London Watch Week, please do make sure to visit both Daniel and Nick while you're there, because I'm sure that there's many more tales to dig into that you'll be able to explore when you meet them in person. If you have any questions for the guys and you know how to get in touch with us, you can contact us on Instagram at therealtime.show or via the official contact form on the very official website, www.therealtime.show. We'll be back soon with more top quality watch content and interviews with the industry's finest. Until then, stay safe and keep on ticking.